Sometimes a special teacher can have a life-changing impact on a young person, especially when that kid doesn't quite fit in their conservative environment and has a secret to keep. This is Josh's story. Josh grew up just outside of Houston in a very conservative town. He felt he had a great childhood, but was at odds with religion from a very young age, which proved to be difficult in that conservative town. He was always different and very emotional and sentimental, and never was drawn to sports or trucks or anything that most people typically thought boys should like. He loved school. He loved reading and writing. But the older he got, the more he felt he had to keep his passions and his interests a secret. His parents, great as they were very critical if he showed any interest in art house films, which he loved. He started the Young Democrats Club at his high school, and he was the only member. It was so difficult to find anyone who got him. Then junior year came around, and he had an AP English teacher who would change his life. Mrs. Campbell. Mrs. Campbell was a small, older woman who seemed quiet and calm, but she would prove to be brilliant and brave. She fearlessly taught about feminism. She exposed the students to Black authors and explored topics Josh never thought he could or would experience. He absolutely fell in love with written word again, and he had found someone who accepted him for who he was. She saw him. And he went to her classroom every day after school, and they talked about the Oscar season movies, the books they had read, politics, art, all the things Josh hadn't been able to discuss with anyone else. Meanwhile, he discovered his mom had started collecting books by Focus on the Family, with titles like How to Deal with and Fix Your Gay Son. And when Josh found them, it was devastating, and he fell into a depression. That year, the movie Brokeback Mountain came out, and Josh had to sneak out to see it, and he could never dare tell his parents. They unfortunately found out, and shortly after, sent him to his priest for conversion. To his surprise, the priest said he wasn't sinning. The priest was genuinely kind and sent Josh away with a smile. His parents, not feeling satisfied with that result, contacted Exodus International, a Christian conversion therapy program, and drove him about an hour away to his first session. Something that still hurts him deeply to know his parents would do. In order to cope, Josh can only remember fragments of this part of his life because he tried to forget it ever happened. One thing he does remember is being put in a dark room with another man, and he felt extremely uncomfortable and uneasy. Josh guessed that this man was the therapist. And the man spoke with Josh about his willingness to change. Then he left the room and made him watch a movie, which was basically several men telling stories of how they prayed the gay away and converted. Despite being physically alone in the room, Josh felt he was being watched the entire time, and he felt like he was being brainwashed. It was bizarre and unsettling. They talked about how Josh would get AIDS and a lot of other sexual things that Josh hadn't even thought of. None of this felt appropriate for a 16-year-old to be experiencing. He knows he returned for more sessions, but he doesn't remember anything else. That same year, Josh entered the Scholastic Writing Awards contest with a portfolio, and Mrs. Campbell was there to see him read in front of hundreds of people. She was also there to see him win the highest award in the region, and she bought him an art history book as a gift. Over the next 15 years, Josh had been trying to contact Mrs. Campbell to let her know how much she meant to him. He wanted to let her know that he was becoming an English teacher too, and how she still inspires him, and how she changed his life. He says, even though he never came out to her, he knows she knew. And Josh feels that no one has ever had such an influence on him, and it made him sad to think he'd never gotten to thank her for all these years. One day, he met up with an old high school friend who mentioned she had kept in touch with her old high school English teacher, who turned out to be Mrs. Campbell. Finally, Josh had found her. He was so excited but nervous to email her. After all, a lot can change over 15 years. But he wrote, and he sent that email to Mrs. Campbell, and he poured his heart out and told her she had saved him in so many ways. He wrote quotes from their favorite movie, Brokeback Mountain, and they corresponded and they caught up on everything. She confessed that when he'd won that writing award all those years ago, she hadn't intended to give him that art history book. She bought him a copy of Annie Proulx's Brokeback Mountain and asked his mom if she could give it to him as a gift. And his mom said no. When Josh heard that, he felt the same betrayal he experienced 15 years earlier all over again. But Mrs. Campbell still had that copy of Brokeback Mountain that she had intended to give Josh on her shelf after all these years. And she asked if she could give it to him now. And he said yes. And here's what Mrs. Campbell wrote to him in that copy of Brokeback Mountain. Dear Josh, congratulations many years later for being awarded 2 gold keys in the Scholastic Writing Competition 2007. You and I will always be bound together by our mutual love for the written word. That said, cheers to us, Ennis and Jack, iconic characters who will always resonate with our society. With love and respect, Pam Campbell.